When we understand the casualties that Russians are suffering here, I mean, it's just, I mean, it sounds very trite to say an industrial scale, but there was a report out of the UK Ministry of Defence intelligence update a few weeks ago saying that the Russians were losing over 1,000 people a day, and they'd lost 70,000 in the last 60 days. I mean, that is just unimaginable. And overall, they've lost 600,000 soldiers, which, for a population the size of Russia is not sustainable.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hanson, and today we're talking to one of our regular guests here on Frontline, Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. Hamish is a former commander of the Royal Tank Regiment who served in operations during the First Gulf War, as well as in Cyprus, Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq and Afghanistan, commanding main battle tanks for around 24 years. On top of that, Hamish also commanded NATO's Rapid Reaction Chemical, Biological and Radiological Nuclear Battalion and is a Biosecurity Fellow at Magdalen College, Cambridge. Hamish, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
My pleasure. Thanks very much for having me.
To begin with, I wonder if I can get your thoughts on what happened at the end of last week, this apparent arson attack on the French rail network. Obviously caused huge travel disruption on the day of the opening ceremony of the Paris Olympics. Suspicions have been raised in various directions. What's your reading of what maybe happened?
I think, first of all, this was a very sophisticated operation. There was sabotage on 4 different sites, I understand, varying up to 100, 200 kilometers outside of Paris. And they were on sort of strategic pieces of the railway where other bits came together and affected signal boxes. And as you said, disrupted the journeys of, hundreds of thousands of people, just as everybody was focusing on the games. Now, I'm sure, and I know, having been involved actually with some of the security elements to the Olympic Games over the last couple of years, the amount of effort and detail that has gone into it, as it should be, to make the games as secure as possible. And a whole host of threats and other areas are looked at, and potential people who would want to do this sort of thing. But when I look at this with my sort of security hat on, I am, I'm pretty surprised of the sophistication and the synchronization of these attacks. This is not, to me, certainly not by lone wolf. Certainly not by, disgruntled groups, maybe in France. I mean, there's talk about the far left, and, the far left is a threat in France. But whether it has the capability to do all of this, and I think very importantly, under the most stringent guise of the French security services, Europol, and no doubt a whole bunch of others. So that, to me, means that whoever is behind this is a pretty joined up organization. Now, I fought the Islamic State with the Peshmerga of northern Iraq for a number of years, saw them up close. I saw Al-Qaeda up close when I was still in the British military. And again, it strikes me that this sort of attack might possibly be with them or might just be on. So I think we have to look at who might be behind it. And, a lot of people are blaming Russia or Russian proxies. And I think when you look at the modus operandi, this is out of sort of the Russian playbook. I'm talking to you from Salisbury today, where we had the Russian Secret Service Novichok attack, 6 years ago. So it's that sort of level of capability is well within their gaze. And I think when you think back, I think it was probably in April this year where Macron believed that the Russians might try and interfere with the Olympic Games. The Russians themselves have been incredibly critical and verbose about the Olympics because, of course, they've been discarded, and they would gain more than most. So I think Russia is certainly in the frame. They haven't really commented. They haven't denied it or anything else. You would expect that they did. I think they are rather sort of reveling in it. And one other piece to this, James, we're learning there is a story in the Daily Telegraph today about the French Interior Minister receiving an envelope full of plague over the weekend. Now, plague, bubonic plague or pneumonic plague, whatever it is a very, very deadly pathogen. Again, it's difficult to get the full details, but what the report says is this was sort of black powder in an envelope and with a threatening note coming with it. To me, that means that this plague may have been weaponized. And with pathogens, you actually, if you want to use them as a terror weapon, a bio weapon, you need to prepare them. It's just chucking anthrax or plague around is not necessarily going to have the effect you want. But if you weaponize it, in other words, put it into a form that is easily that people can easily ingest, like this is suggesting, again, this is not a simple task. It's not beyond the bounds of possibility that somebody who's highly trained in these sort of things could do it. But again, it's sort of leading back to more sophistication. So I think the jury is still out. It is possibly the Russians or Russian proxies, possibly some far left terror groups, but it was a very sophisticated operation. And under such heavy guise of the Olympics, to get this all coordinated and succeed and disrupt so many people, it's something that I'm absolutely certain the French are investigating in great detail, and we will probably learn more in the coming days and weeks.
Yeah, and one thing we do know is that a Russian national was arrested last week, I believe on Wednesday last week, on suspicion of trying to sabotage the Olympics. Although, as you say, the events on Friday, I'm sure we'll find out more about in due course. What more could the French authorities do? And not just the French authorities, but other Western nations who Russia may be trying to sabotage in some way. What more could they be doing to try and mitigate the risk?
Well, it's hugely challenging. I mean, we know there are a lot of Russian agents and their proxies all across Europe, and a few years ago there'd been an awful lot in the UK. I think the UK has become a little bit of a no-go zone for them after the Salisbury event, where a lot of their infrastructure was removed. But again, it's a question of being on the balls of their feet. I mean, you cannot be 100% secure in absolutely everything. And an event like the Olympics, which the world is watching, unfortunately, this is the sort of event where terrorists and people who want to create mayhem are looking for events that will be reported around the world, and that's exactly what the Olympics is. But I think I'm pretty certain that the French are doing all they can. Of course, the public have a key role to play as well, because they've got the millions of eyes and ears on the ground and need to report things as they see fit. But yeah, I expect that actually within the ring of Paris where the Olympics are going, I wouldn't be at all concerned about going there, and I don't think people should be. But again, it's like all of these things. If you've absolutely secured Paris, then there are possibly other places where you're going to have to take risk. And again, that is where the terror and the state actors will look to have an impact. So yeah, I'm sure the French are doing all that they can and sort of in a way holding their breath until it's all over. But Russia has other problems, and no doubt Putin and his generals and those around him will be heavily focused on what's happening in Ukraine at the moment as well, rather than spending too much time and effort trying to create another, if it was them, sort of mark event in and around Paris.
We're going to turn to events on the ground in Ukraine very shortly. I just wanted to ask you, Hamish, it's interesting you referencing that you're speaking to us from the city of Salisbury, which is a place that knows better than most the lengths to which Vladimir Putin is willing to go. And I suppose the ultimate fear as to the lengths he's willing to go revolves around whether he would use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, for instance. And he did a bit of nuclear saber rattling over the weekend. He made a speech in St. Petersburg at the main naval parade there, and he talked about the US planning to station missile systems in Germany in 2026 and deployments they've got it in the Philippines and Denmark as well. And he did engage again in a bit of nuclear saber rattling. How seriously should we be taking those warnings at the moment?
Well, I think we should take them with the disdain with what they're given, actually. And the other thing to note is the Americans are planning to put tactical nuclear weapons in the UK, which I think is a very good move. It would be very interesting to see the reaction of the new government to that. But when it comes on to Putin's saber rattling, it's very much focused on some of the more timid leaders in Europe. And it does have an impact because it worries them. But the plain fact is, really since the 24th of February 2022, virtually every week, Putin or some of his attack dogs like Medvedev or Peskov have threatened the nuclear peace because they know that it's holding things back. And certainly, I've been talking about the drip feed of weapons into Ukraine from the very start. And that drip feed, a lot of that has been caused by concern over the nuclear issue. But just to unpack it a little bit, when he's threatening his tactical nuclear weapons, these are the battlefield nuclear weapons, they are still massive explosions. They're still the size of sort of Hiroshima and Nagasaki back in the Second World War. It's absolutely massive. But compared to what we call the strategic nuclear missiles, they're fairly small. But when we look at those tactical nuclear itself, I don't think that he can use them. And I'll tell you why. They are either on Iskander missiles, which have a range of about 400 miles, or they're delivered from strategic aircraft, which again need to be within about 400 miles of their target. What has been very clear that certainly around Kharkiv, when the Ukrainians were given permission from the US and the UK and others to use precision-guided missiles like ATACMS, like Storm Shadow, to attack strategic targets, that enabled them, in theory, to take out these launchers or these aircraft before they get off the ground. And I expect that is why, in a way, it's been done. And a nod, although they're not saying it publicly, but Putin and his generals know that that is the case. So even now that Ukraine has these missiles, I think, and because the range is relatively short, these missile launchers and aircraft need to get to the border of Ukraine. And actually, even 400 miles into Ukraine ain't that far. So I do not believe that either Ukraine, supported by NATO or NATO directly, would allow these tactical nuclear missiles to be used. Also, I think we may have discussed in the past, and I may have written in the Times in the past, that there is a view that actually a lot of these Russian tactical nuclear missiles and bombs are not in great condition either, like a lot of Russian equipment. So they may not even work. So when you put all that together, I think, and I've written often enough and said often enough, it's all bluff and bluster, and it needs to be called out. And the other key thing when it comes to Europe, ourselves and the French have nuclear weapons, and Putin knows that. And that, people might be thinking that if Trump gets elected in November, the Americans are going to become less interested in Europe, less involved. Well, that might be a scenario, but the basic scenario that the UK and France have a nuclear capability, again, I think absolutely puts a stop on Putin. So, yeah, a very long answer to your question. I think it's bluff and bluster, and it should be ignored.
Let's turn to the situation on the ground in Ukraine at the moment. How would you describe the phase of the war that we're in at the moment?
Yeah, I think we're in a really interesting time. I suppose I would say transition. This year, it's the Russians who've been on the offensive. They had a massive offensive around Kharkiv, up in the northeast. And the fact, and that, at some stage, we were really concerned that they were going to make significant ground. Then I think when the US and the UK and others allowed weaponry to be used on targets in Russia, that really thwarted the attack there. So airfield's been taken out with these ATACMS and Storm Shadow and other key bits and pieces. Really, and when we understand the casualties that Russians are suffering here, it sounds very trite to say an industrial scale, but there was a report out of the UK Ministry of Defence intelligence update a few weeks ago saying that the Russians were losing over 1,000 people a day and they'd lost 70,000 in the last 60 days. I mean, that is just unimaginable. And overall, they've lost 600,000 soldiers, which, for a population the size of Russia is not sustainable. A whole host of things. And what we're seeing is, because they are having to rush conscripts to the front, and again, relying on mainly ethnic Russians from the east and prisoners. I mean, I shouldn't think there's virtually a prison in Russia with any people in it, because they're all at the front. I mean, the ones who are in prison are generally prisoners who've been to the front, done their year or 6 months, got off, committed another crime, gone back to prison, and then back out to the front. I mean, you just couldn't make it up. It's quite unbelievable. But mainly their conscripts are untrained. And with untrained conscripts, all they can virtually do is hold a rifle and fire. So they can't really, I don't think there's any danger that there's going to be a serious breakthrough with a great combination of armor and artillery. We did see last week one of the biggest Russian offensives down in the south, which, I think it was about 11 tanks and 40 other armored vehicles, which sounds big, but on the bigger scheme of things, it's pretty small. But that was disrupted. So I say transition. So things are relatively static. Now, there is a lot of hope that Ukraine can get on the offensive. And there are a number of positives, I think, here. I mean, first of all, the Ukraine maritime, and I don't call it navy because they haven't really got a navy, have defeated the Great Black Sea Fleet. The significance of this is that Ukraine now has freedom of maneuver in the Black Sea. And that is hugely significant, because I think, and I'm not alone in suggesting that Crimea is a real possibility, that, quite apart from, forget about the Donbass and the areas east in Ukraine, Ukraine could possibly retake Crimea because the Black Sea Fleet's not there to protect it. We've seen over the last few months, and particularly last few weeks, the amount of attacks going into the Crimea to take out airfields where some of their key weaponry is, and take out their air defense, taking a heck of a battering. Only last week we heard that Putin is redirecting air defense units to protect his own palaces in Moscow and Sochi, which is remarkable. So that is significant. We've talked about the permission that Ukraine has to use weaponry outside Ukraine's territory into Russia. And what the news this week is that the much vaunted, much talked about F-16s are, there are rumors that there are some in Ukraine already, but about to arrive. And this is really vexing the Russians. Now, whether there are going to be enough F-16s to have a difference. And the key thing with the F-16s is about air power. Now, one of the main reasons that the Ukrainians have not been able to progress is that Russia has controlled the skies. And if you control the skies, you do not have freedom of maneuver on the ground. So you're very vulnerable to that. Now, in the last few months, that control of the air has been on the move. So we've had air parity. Russia no longer has freedom of maneuver in the skies. And if it loses, and if Ukraine gets air superiority, then we're in a very, very different situation. And there's not a lot the Russians can do about it, because going back to training, whether you're training tank crews or whether you're training individuals to fight in a trench, it still takes time. When I was commanding officer of the 1st Royal Tank Regiment, it took us over a year to train to then go and do the sort of operations that tank regiments are supposed to do. Now, Russia is doing this in days, so quite not surprisingly. And when it comes to aircraft, of course, Russia doesn't have an inexhaustible supply of aircraft. And, Ukraine is just one area for them. They've also got the rest of NATO that they think they need to defend against. And they've got a vast country to protect. So, yeah, I think the balance should, let's hope it does, start moving towards Ukraine with all these various things happening. And I think the other thing that is really galvanizing people is the US election, because both Trump and his running mate Vance have indicated that they are likely to, maybe they might not stop aid completely, but significantly. And whether the rest of Europe and the other NATO countries can pick up the slack of this 60 billion or so dollars that America's spending annually is very questionable. So there is a desire to try and make a significant move before that happens.
I want to come back to the F-16s in a moment, but I was really struck by what you said there, Hamish, about Putin transferring air defences to protect his palaces in Moscow and Sochi. And, it's fascinating how we talk so much about military tactics and military logistics, but actually, human emotion and psychology comes into this so much, particularly when you're dealing with a character like Vladimir Putin, who is paralysed, it seems, by paranoia.
Entirely. I mean, I think that whole piece is actually a brilliant bit of subterfuge by the Ukrainians, because I think it was in April that they had said that they had flown a number of drones that attacked all fineries north of Moscow and flew them over Putin's palace in Moscow. And that seems to have perpetuated this desire to rearrange their air defense systems. And the Russian MOD said basically we've reviewed where our air defense is and we're moving it to high value targets. So if you're a young Russian at the front and you see your anti-aircraft cover moving back to protect Putin in one of his luxury palaces, I would have thought your morale takes a bit of a hammering. But it absolutely does show that. I mean, but Putin is a classic Russian tyrannical leader. None of them end well, and like a lot of tyrants, they are more concerned about their own well-being than the people they purport to lead and direct, as it were. So I think it is very, very telling that is happening. And of course, protecting his luxury villas in Sochi and his palaces all around the place, when he's got limited assets, is actually making the chance of it progressing in Ukraine that much less. So great. Let's hope he continues to do it.
Just to go back to the F-16s, the sense is that their arrival is pretty imminent, or their deployment is pretty imminent. They may indeed be in Ukraine already. How do the Ukrainians protect them? Because, the Russians will be trying to spot them and target them and launch airstrikes against them.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And a lot of the Russian telegram channels are talking about the F-16s, saying that they know where they're going to be. There was a report of an airfield in Ukraine being hit the other day, and the Russians claiming they'd destroyed some F-16s. The Ukrainians said that they were mock-up F-16s. I think, this is a war of propaganda and disinformation. Intuitively, one believes the Western view, the Russian view. There is so much rubbish that comes out of it that one just doesn't believe anything they say. In fact, usually the truth is 180 degrees from what they're saying. But it's a great point how you protect them and where they come from. It's going to be a challenge. They're going to have to be very agile. I expect moved a hell of a lot. No doubt there'll be a lot of sophisticated electronic warfare being used, no doubt supported by US and British and French and other assets that can do this. And they will be used for high value targets, no doubt. But again, I think, I said earlier, I think that the Ukrainians are very canny. And no doubt it's a sort of double-edged weapon. If the Russians are so focused on tracking down these F-16s, then it gives opportunities elsewhere. We've seen Putin wants to put all his air defense assets to protect himself. And no doubt he's told the Russian high command, take out those F-16s. Well, while they're putting so much focus on them, the Ukrainian organic fighter jets could be, creating merry hell elsewhere. So, yeah, all of these things are not straightforward, but with every sort of downside, there's usually an opportunity that can be exploited as well. And the fact that the F-16 is such a big deal, the fact that the Russians are so excited about it, if I was a Ukrainian commander, I'd be licking my lips and thinking, right, this is something we can really use to try and do something else, as it were. And I'm sure that if an F-16 comes up against an ancient Russian fighter, it will perform pretty well too. I mean, there's a lot. I know that Russian Telegram channels are saying that there are only 6 Ukrainian pilots trained to fly these things, and a whole bunch of other stuff. I haven't seen that. I wouldn't believe it. So I think the F-16 is a real turning point, not for itself, but because of what else it might enable.
Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for your insight and analysis and for joining us today on Frontline.
A pleasure. Thanks for having me.